So make sure you're paying attention for the reading and the reading questions that will come out at the end of this week for that. If you have any questions, please let me know. So today we have Dr. Wilford, who is the chief of the Division of Bioethics in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He is also a professor in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities there. Chief of the Bioethics Consultation Service, and attends the chest clinic in the Division of Pulmonary Medicine. He is a member of the Institute of Translational Health Sciences Steering Committee and coordinates the Steering Committee's Research Bioethics Consult Service. And today, Dr. Wilford will be speaking about the public attitudes to research.
Thank you. It's a really pleasure to talk with you all today. You know, I was thinking before I came here, I was wondering how my talk, which is really focused about research and research ethics and public attitudes about research ethics, how does it relate to you as medical students? And so I have an answer for that, but the way I'm going to get to the answer is by asking you guys some questions. So there will be some audience participation here. So I want to begin with a story of my own life. When I turned 40, for a couple of years, around that time, I was seeing my primary care doctor, and my blood pressure was gradually going up. He said, well, you know, you need to exercise more. So I tried exercising a little more. You need to watch what you're eating, cut down salt. Try doing that. Anyway, make a long story short, I still needed, my blood pressure was still elevated, and he said, it's time to prescribe a medication for your blood pressure. So what I want to ask you, if you were my doctor, what medication would you prescribe for me? So you guys have all had pharmacology now. You have some idea of what the medications can be used for hypertension. So I'm interested in kind of getting some impressions from folks about what they might select as a first medication for somebody like myself, age 40, new onset hypertension, no other prior medical problems. What would you pick? So just go ahead. Just somebody raise your hands. What's that? Which one? Okay, so hydrochlorothiazide, that's one of our suggestions. Anybody else? Something else? Okay, which one? Okay, that's 2. Anybody else? I hear somebody say beta blocker. Anyone in particular? Oh, propranolol. Okay, so 3 different choices. Okay, so how do we know why? Now, obviously, different people answer, but why would you pick one over the other? Why? How do we know which is the right medication to pick? But do we really? Okay. And research. Well, or I would say the lack of research. The issue is that we probably don't really know. You know, the fact that you guys gave me 3 answers is probably suggests that maybe there isn't enough research to know which is really the best medication. When I asked my doctor wrote out a prescription for me, and I said, so why this particular medication? He goes, well, that's what the drug companies are pushing these days, was his answer for me. He was very honest. We had a further conversation about what to do. But the point I want to get to is this question about medical practice and the fact that often much of medical practice is not based with sufficient evidence to actually know what to do. And it can be more than one right answer. So the topic that I'll be talking with you about today is really thinking about the ethical issues related to research, trying to improve medical practice, and distinguishing that from research trying to establish new innovative interventions that have never been done before. So that's just kind of a way of helping you thinking about this. And the question that comes up for this is, again, I want you to think back to the idea of me being the patient with hypertension and how much time you would take to discuss with me the medication you're choosing and why. And I also want you to think for a moment, if instead of picking whichever one of the 3 you mentioned, if instead you had decided that what you're going to do is to enroll me in a study comparing a beta blocker to a thiazide, how would that discussion be different? How much longer would it be? How much shorter would it be? More materials or not? And whether there should be a difference between how you approach that clinical question and the question in the context of research. That's kind of that's what this project is about. So, and what I'm going to do today is actually do several things. First, I'm going to give you a historical description of a study of oxygen saturation levels that was done about 10 years ago that was described in the New York Times editorial as startling and deplorable. And as a result of that study, the Office of Human Research Protections, which is the agency that sort of oversees IRBs that supervise research, decided that research on medical practices that use randomization are substantially risky. But then tell you about how, in fact, the public has a different view about the role of informed consent for this type of research compared to the regulators. So that's what this entire thing is going to be about. I'm going to start with, I guess I would call the disclosures, but really more of a context. So, I've been studying issues of informed consent for over 20 years now, and so I've been very interested in informed consent. I've been a chair of IRBs that oversee research and realized that this can be a very challenging thing to do. And also, as a pediatric pulmonologist, I take care of babies in the NICU, neonatal intensive care unit. So when the study came out, it was very interesting for me. Since this controversy that I'll tell you about with the New York Times began in 2013, I've kept myself busy writing a variety of papers on this topic, and this is just a recent list of the various papers I've written on issues related to this, and I'll be sharing some of that with you today. So this began not really that long ago and not in a galaxy far away, but right here in the United States. In the early 2000s, there were a range of target oxygen saturations between 85 and 95% that were used in NICUs. And the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, had recommendations for what target saturations to provide for babies in the intensive care unit. But there was uncertainty about whether the higher or lower end of this range would be better at avoiding the complications of retinopathy and cognitive development. Retinopathy of prematurity, is a disease that's caused by giving too much oxygen. And in fact, the way we learned about this disease was because in general, it was not traditional to do research in babies. And so in the 1950s and 40s, when oxygen became available to give to babies in the NICU, they thought was, oh, this is a great thing, we can really help babies. So they gave babies lots of oxygen, and they all got blind. In fact, does anybody know of anybody who has retinopathy of prematurity? Anybody famous? So you do, but you just don't know he does. Stevie Wonder was blind, was born premature, and his blindness is from retinopathy of prematurity. Just to put this into context for you. So the issue, though, is that we knew that we shouldn't give too much oxygen. That's why the 95% being the cutoff on the high end. And the sense that 85 was considered to the low end. But the question was, are we better off being lower or higher within that range? So this question was resulted in a study that was done. And actually, it was a complicated study because actually it chose to study two different questions simultaneously. One was to look at the difference of target oxygen saturations between the 85, either in the high 80s or the low 90s. It also was comparing giving surfactant or CPAP in the delivery room. But I'm going to focus mainly on the oxygen part of it. This was done as a double-blind trial. And what that meant is that the oximeters that measure the oxygen levels were altered so that regardless of which arm you were in, the oxygen saturation monitor would read between 88 and 92%. So it's going to read in the middle, either as offset 3% one direction or the other. And then the idea is that if it ever went below 85 or above 95, then the alarms would go off. And so the idea was to try to see whether there's going to be a difference in retinopathy based upon which group they were in. This study enrolled over 1,300 kids around 23 centers around the United States. And in fact, there were even 5 related studies around the world trying to look at this question. The point about this is to illustrate how important this question was identified internationally as an unanswered question about medical practice. One of the things I want to point out is that this was actually a harder study to do because for those, as you will learn next year in your rotations, if you rotate through the the NICU, or if you do it in your fourth year, you can't, even if you say we're going to try to keep oxygen saturations between a certain number, they do go up and they do go down. And so what this is actually showing you that in spite of those two groups, there's a lot of overlap between the two groups. In fact, prior to the study results coming out, the concern was that we might not see a difference between the two groups because, in fact, there wasn't this clear demarcation between them. And in fact, the study did not have a positive finding. There was no difference between the two groups on the primary endpoint. Now, the primary endpoint was called a composite endpoint. It was two different pieces. It was retinopathy or death, because the thought was if you are dead, you can't have retinopathy. So they assumed that anybody who died did have retinopathy as a way of being conservative with their findings. And so there was no difference. But what's important, if you look at this table here, is that they went in different directions. So in the lower saturation group, there was half as much retinopathy, but death was slightly increased. And because they went in different directions, that's why there was no overall positive finding. But in fact, there were significant differences in different directions between the two groups. As a result of this study, the conclusion was we ought to be careful about keeping saturations on the low range, because while it may help retinopathy, there appears to be some possible increased risk of death. So we need to be mindful of that. So this was in 2010, if you see on the screen there. In 2013, the Office of Human Research Protection sent a letter to the University of Alabama, which was the primary site for this study. And what the OHRP does, they'll send these determination letters. And this was after the result of inquiries back and forth, getting documents, having discussions, and this is our sort of final answer. And their determination was that the investigators incorrectly believed that because all infants were randomized to oxygen levels within the standard range, it follows that the study involved no more than minimal risk, which is, in medical speak, that's the way of saying that it did involve more than minimal risk. Everything's always double negatives, you know. More importantly, the risks of the randomization made it more likely that there'd be differences in the outcomes of the two groups, including death, neurologic problems, and ROP. I want you to pay attention to this notion of risks of randomization, because that's one of the questions. Is there a risk of randomization itself? More importantly, they said that the informed consent form did not adequately describe any reasonable and foreseeable risks. Again, the question was it reasonable and foreseeable that there would be a difference in death between the two groups? And that the form should have explained that the study involved substantial risks. So a pretty significant set of concerns about this study that I just described. Now, the required action that they suggested was provide a plan to ensure that informed consent documents include and adequately address the basic elements of informed consent. This is about going forward. So almost, does it strike you that there's a disconnect between those determinations and the plan? And I remember reading this, and I thought to myself, I actually thought the plan was very reasonable, because my thought was, I'm not sure they got all those determinations correct, but I'll explain in a few moments why that is. But I remember when this came out in 2013, I thought, this is kind of interesting. So what happened next, though, before I get to that, what happened next, let me give you some more information about the informed consent forms. Because I actually do think that they were correct with identifying a challenge with the informed consent documents, although I'm not sure I would describe it at the level that it has been described by others as being startling and deplorable. And what's important here is in these two different consent forms, one from Alabama, one from San Diego, is in often informed consents, they will have different areas of the consent form, and one is a purpose and one are risks and benefits. And what I want to point out is that in the purpose section, it describes that the purpose should be to pinpoint the exact range that should be used to prevent some of the problems that occur, such as retinopathy. And it gives you the context of that. In this other form, under risks and benefits, it says because all the treatments proposed in the study are standard of care, there's no increased risk in your baby. But then it goes on to say, but there may be benefits to your child directly, including a decrease in chronic lung disease or a decreased need for eye surgery from this. Now, the issue, I think there's two issues here. One is that, in my view, you can't say on one hand there's no risk, but there are benefits. either there's risks and benefits, or you say that there are no risks and benefits of being in the study. But they kind of, so I think there was a problem with this. But the more important problem is that I think there's conflation about whether something is a benefit and risk of the study versus what's the purpose of the research itself. And I think that, in my own view, that in fact this was a study that itself offered no significant risks or benefits by being in the study compared to standard practice. And the purpose of the research was to find out if there was a difference between the two. Now, hopefully all I'll do is give you some more information to help make all this make sense to you. But what happened the next month was that there was an editorial in the New York Times that described this study and talked, which is pretty significant, the idea that the New York Times wrote an editorial about this. They're more used to doing other things. And they talked about that this project failed to meet the most basic standard, providing an informed consent document to parents that accurately described the risks and benefits of the research that was conducted on extremely premature babies. This failure was startling and deplorable. Now, April 15th, 2013, I was actually visiting my mother in Florida. I was moving her from her apartment to an assisted living facility. And as part of that, I was reading through, I found this box of stuff that she had collected from me, including a box that she had collected from when I was in college. And there was an article that was written in the student newspaper about me and a colleague of mine, because what we had done is we actually had organized a petition for the student body because one of the professors had been denied tenure, and myself and my colleague thought this was unfair for a variety of reasons. As college students, we probably didn't quite understand all the complexities of how all these things happen, but for us, this was a really good professor. We really liked him a lot, and he was like probably the best teacher I ever had, and it just struck me as a real injustice. So we got half the student body to sign this petition. The article was actually a very interesting article because it was actually about why we did this. And the point was they're choosing to do this rather than going out and drinking beer and going to parties. And it was more of a human interest story. Isn't this weird that students are doing this? But when I looked at that article, I thought about the support trial, this New York Times editorial. And I thought to myself, you know, I really don't have time for that anymore. I don't have time to fight these things that strike me as being inappropriate because I've got more important things to do. I got to do my day job. I got things to get done. I got projects to do. But then I went home. And I kept on thinking about it and I decided I started talking to more people about it, and I thought, and the issue for me was that I thought that the risks of the study were not as much as was thought about. So I started contacting colleagues, and we ended up getting 45 people together and wrote a letter to OHRP trying to explain what our views were about this. As you can imagine, getting 45 people in bioethics and pediatrics to agree upon a 4-paragraph letter was itself a monumental task. But we wrote our letter, and we also sent our letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, and they published our letter with 45 signatures. And the main point we made was that we acknowledged that the permission forms could have been improved, because there was no question in our mind that they were not as good as they could have been. They were and there were some issues. But we disagreed that the random assignment of infants imposed additional risks. And that's the key issue, that we didn't think that there were additional risks of the study. And therefore, there's no additional risks. They can't fail to disclose those risks. We did think that they should have been more clear about why the study was being done and make sure that was discussed, but we didn't think that was a risk. Now, 2 weeks later, there was another letter to the editor of the New England Journal that said the serious deficient nature of the consent documents and the determination of OHRP was justified and did not overreach. Now, how do you deal with the fact that there's two different views about this? Well, you can simply just look at the number of signatures on the two sides, and it's sort of like the Missouri primaries. It can be close, but somebody's got to win. Obviously, that's not the answer, but it's a start. Actually, the answer, I think, comes from this next slide, from Gary Larson. Late at night and without permission, Reuben would often enter the nursery and conduct experiments with static electricity. The question is, what do we emphasize here? Why is this cartoon funny? In my mind, this cartoon is funny because the issue is not the lack of consent or the lack of oversight doing it late at night. The issue is that it's risky to hang babies from the ceiling. The risk is a central issue here. And and the difference between the two views had to do with whether we were focusing on risk or informed consent. What happened next was that OHR, after our first letter came out, in fact, not necessarily because of our letter, but it's hard to know how things work in Washington, OHRP actually put a hold on their determination, and so they wanted more time to think about it. They actually held a hearing on August 28th, 2013, actually the same day as the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech, so it's kind of an interesting day to be in DC because we're doing our little thing and there's all this other stuff happening in town. But they had 27 presenters who spent 7 minutes discussing their views on this issue. If you are ever bored on a Saturday, are tired of studying, and don't want to watch Netflix, you can go to this website and you can watch these 27 7-minute presentations, and it's quite entertaining. It took a year after that for OHRP to come up with a draft guidance. Their draft guidance sort of reinforced their original position and said that the reasonably foreseeable risks of research in a study includes the already identified risks of the standards of care being evaluated as a purpose of the research. When the risks being evaluated are different from the risks some of the subjects would be exposed to outside the study. So what they're saying is that if you study something that's part of standard of care, it becomes a risk of research, not simply a risk of standard of care. So the idea is that if you're prescribing my medication for high blood pressure, there may be risks and benefits of the medication. But if you decide to study it, those risks of the medication are now risks of the research. And I think that's where I had a difference. That's a risk of the study, of the medications, but not necessarily a risk of research per se. And that's a very important distinction. I think there's a couple issues going on here, and the second bullet point is one I just made. But I think it's important because what it does is it makes research that otherwise might be described as minimal risk research as being greater than minimal risk. And the significance of that is that it may mislead people to their view of the research and how they assess that research and whether this is really substantially research. And it also suggests the risks of harms can be avoided by not being in the research. My colleague David Magnus from Stanford, who I worked with on this project, we wrote an article to Pediatrics about this. And this is the point that we emphasize, that if investigators and IRB exaggerate risks, it could make it harder to recruit children into valuable research. But more importantly, parents may misattribute unavoidable risks of clinical care as avoidable research risks. And I'll give you an example of that from the perspective of patients, and that's why I got interested in this. This was a letter, article that was written in the Tampa Bay Times in October of 2013, written by a journalist who had a premature baby. And she describes her experience being in the NICU and having a premature baby. And even more importantly than those OHRP videos, I would definitely encourage you, if you're interested, to go and look up this article, because it's an incredibly well-written article. And I'm going to show you 2 quotes from that article. The first is her description of being asked in a clinical context to sign a consent form. And she says, "Signing those forms was my first official act as her mother, and the responsibility made my cheeks hot. But I didn't read a single one. The only thing I remember about any of those forms was how it felt to write next to my name that I was her mom." And so she talks about what it means to sign these forms. But then she goes on and talks about the idea of research. And again, her child actually did quite well. Here he is at 2 years of age. But she said, "Had I been asked, I probably would have signed her up for a research study. If things had gone well, I might have believed the study had helped. If things had gone poorly, I might have blamed the study and fear I'd been duped." And this, to me, is the essence of the problem, or the challenge. And this is why I really feel very sincerely that there's an issue here, because the question is whether or not the parents who enrolled their children in the support study, were they duped? Did they harm their kids? Were they failing in their obligations as parents to protect their children from this research study? Or were the problems they faced the problems of prematurity? This is not a trivial issue, because it really has to do with how parents should think about and appraise those issues for themselves. Now, what I want to point out here is that the support study and the other types of trials we're talking about, the example of hypertension, are things that I would describe as not the traditional way of thinking of clinical research where we're trying to establish a new practice. It's one of the other ways that we try to figure out what to do. One of them is we call comparative effectiveness research, which is essentially these types of projects. We also can think of clinical innovations, where we just try new things. And also the idea of quality improvement, where we have what we believe are new approaches, good approaches, but we're not really doing them very well, so we try to figure out how to do them better. So for example, we know that that's a good thing to wash your hands before you're seeing patients, but we also know that people don't do that, so trying to figure out how to get more people to wash their hands. We can do studies, we can randomize, we can do things like that. The idea and the question are, how do we think about the ethical implications when we're doing research with the goal of trying to improve medical practice rather than finding new treatments and innovations? And this leads to two interesting bioethics questions that I became interested in as I got more involved with this. The first is, what do public and the regulators think about the ethical implications of randomization within usual practices? So I had my own views about this, but what do others think about this? And then how should these views influence how we think about informed consent? So this was a question that I became interested in after this whole thing happened with support. And we ended up getting, and I'll describe in a few moments, we ended up getting a grant to do a project to study this. We realized, though, that assessing public attitudes is not easy because the concepts that are in here are complicated concepts. Learning health systems, comparative effectiveness research, randomization. These are not things that the average person, if you walk down to the shopping mall, will sort of be familiar with. And the challenge is how to provide enough information without biasing people's attitudes about this. So part of our solution was, again, this new label, ROMP, Research and Medical Practices, as a way of trying to distinguish this from research for new medications and acknowledging that these are FDA-approved medications that some people are already getting, like propranolol and thiazides and ACE inhibitors for hypertension. We also made videos in which we tried to explain some of these basic concepts, because in order to ask the public what they thought of these questions, we figured how to communicate that. And one of the reasons for the videos was that we could spend a lot of time creating them, constructing them, getting feedback, trying to do our best to sort of portray them in a reasonable way. So our team that did this project was incredibly large. It was, again, primarily from Stanford and Seattle, although we had a number of consultants as well as secondary investigators, and we had a lot of collaborations at different clinical sites for recruitment of patients. And so this is just a quick list of the various people that we worked with. We did a number of different things. We actually did focus groups. We also did cognitive interviews in which we actually had a survey, which we actually learned how the survey worked, and we also then developed surveys. We surveyed both IRB members, and we also surveyed people in the public. In the public, we did focus groups from cardiology and nephrology clinics. We did a nationally representative sample through a survey research firm, and we also did surveys of patients in Spokane, Washington. If you want to learn more about our study, we have a website called rompethics.org, and you can go and read more about the study there. It includes all of our study instruments, as well as our videos, as well as the papers that have come out of the study. And if you notice from this comic on here, is that part of what we did in the videos is what we tried to use illustrations in the videos. And in fact, what I'm going to do now is actually show you one of the, oops, let's see how I do. Now I got to figure out how I realize I'm not sure how to click on that. This is the mouse here. Is this the mouse? Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to show you one of the videos.
This is Anthony. Anthony has high blood pressure. And here's Dr. Anderson, Anthony's doctor. She prescribes Anthony medication A to help lower his high blood pressure. Anthony takes medication A, and over the next few weeks, his blood pressure numbers go down. The end. Let's think about this. How does Dr. Anderson decide to use medication A to lower Anthony's high blood pressure, and not medication B, or medication C, D, H, or X? Is A really the best medication for Anthony? To answer these questions, let's take a quick look at all the different factors that might influence Dr. Anderson to choose medication A for Anthony. Dr. Anderson knows that medication A is approved as safe and effective for high blood pressure. Dr. Anderson reads research articles, attends medical conferences, and talks with other doctors about what medications they prefer. Dr. Anderson also knows that medication A is usually affordable for patients. And she knows that in general, most of her patients are able to tolerate medication A's side effects. The company that manufactures medication A provides information about why they think it works well. Conversations between a patient and doctor about the patient's preferences can also sometimes influence treatment decisions. Together, these experiences influence Dr. Anderson so that she usually prescribes medication A for high blood pressure for patients like Anthony. But sometimes in usual day-to-day medical practice, more than one option has been approved as safe and effective, so different doctors can prefer different medications. For example, if Anthony had gone to see Dr. Brown might prescribe medication B, because he has different experiences than Dr. Anderson that lead him to use medication B with patients like Anthony. Or Dr. Chen might prescribe medication C to Anthony because her experiences are different from both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Brown. What's going on here? Which of these doctors is right? Which of them is wrong? What if I told you that all three doctors are correct because medications A, B, and C are all good choices and all work to lower high blood pressure? But doctors don't only want to give their patients a good treatment. They want to give their patients the best treatment possible. The truth is, all three doctors would say that they do not really know which medication is best. The problem is, sometimes there is just not enough information from research comparing medications to know the best choice for patients.
Okay, so those videos we use in focus groups to sort of engage people about these questions. We also, in the focus groups, also got feedback on the video. So actually the video you saw was the final version of the focus group after we got some of the feedback. One of the things we tried to emphasize was the distinction between the variation of doctors for the same patient as distinct from variation of different patients for the same doctor. Because that was actually a very important thing to have people stay clear about. So our goal was to sort of emphasize that point, because people often would talk about the idea of having your doctor personalize for you what to do. And part of what we were trying to explain was if you went to 5 different doctors might give you something different. So we did focus groups. These were published about a little bit over about a year and a half ago. It's a year ago now. And we learned a number of different things from those focus groups. First, that they appreciate that medical practice variation exists, but they trust that their doctor will still make the best decision for them. So people have a lot of trust in their doctors. But that trust was also central to whether they would be willing to be in a study like that, like a ROMP study. Now, we asked them questions about medical record review, which is one of the next video actually talks about medical record review and randomization. So that was one of the key things we were trying to learn about, those two categories. And they assume that medical record review and sharing of data occurs, but they say, gee, nobody ever tells us about this. And they would want their doctor to ask them for permission and make recommendations about participating either in medical record review or a study with randomization. And they thought that a direct, short conversation would be better than a long consent form. But one of the challenges they also had, even in our focus groups, was distinguishing between randomized clinical trials for new drugs and ROMP. And I have two quotes I want to show you from the focus groups to illustrate some of these points. The first is the issue about trust. So him coming to me and saying, this is what I'm going to do, this is the way, I don't need to sign anything. I really have a great relationship and trust him. That would be enough. This notion that I just want you to tell me things, I want you to talk to me, but I trust you, and I trust that you're going to help me make a good decision. Now, when we asked about randomization, this is one of my favorite quotes of the entire set of focus groups. I think randomization with the blind aspect is scary, and I would not prefer it by any means. It makes you feel like you live in Cuba or in Canada. You're just a random number, a random person. Here's your random wide pill. Take that. It seems so sterile and unfriendly. It's foreign. Now, this focus group I was actually leading, and I actually continued to question the person who made this comment. And I clarified, what if your doctor didn't really know which was better? And they really genuinely did. And if we discussed it further, she actually came around. But the important point I wanted to grade here is that, to me, this was a really interesting, not observation, but appreciation of how the notion of randomness, there's this knee-jerk reaction, this is just foreign and scary. And I think that often, even in terms of OHRP, the whole idea of randomization just makes people all in a tizzy. So what we did after is that and I'll tell you a bit more about this, we then took the videos and we did a study in this national sample of around 1,200 people and developed a survey to ask them questions about. The way we did this is that we took, we had the 3 videos, and they were shown, we showed one video, asked some questions, show another video, ask some questions, show another video, ask some questions, and then we had some scenarios. And we had different scenarios about medical record review as well as about randomization to kind of get an idea of what people's attitudes would be. And the scenarios, one was a scenario of medical record review. The other was a scenario of randomization. And the idea of the scenario of randomization was that these were newly diagnosed patients, and they would be randomly assigned, that the patients and their doctors would know which drug they were getting, and that the clinicians would provide their usual follow-up and change the medication if the patients either had an adverse effect, if they weren't responding, or if the patient requested a change. So the idea, this is not the traditional randomized trial where nobody knows what's going on. In fact, partly related to our quote about we don't want to be in Cuba or Canada, and so we want people to know what they're getting. And the question was, well, what would you think of that? Now, I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm actually going to skip a few slides to get to a place where I think we'll be able to end with enough time for questions. So I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides here. And what I want to do is to get to this slide right here. So we asked people, one of the questions we wanted to know about informed consent was what their preferences were for how to get informed consent. We gave them 4 choices. One was they could have discussion and written permission, discussion and verbal permission, general information, a posting on the wall, or no notification. And we also asked them how they would think of that, what their preference would be, whether it was medical record review, randomization for hypertension, or randomization for a more serious condition. What I want to point out here, if you look at the bottom, is that there was not much difference between the types of studies we're doing and those who preferred discussion written permission, which was the predominant view. After that, it was verbal permission, and you can see it goes down from there. So I already showed you how I was inspired by Gary Larson. The other person who inspired us as we thought about the study was Mick Jagger. And the question was, what if you can't get what you want, maybe you can get what you need? And the question we asked our participants was, what if you can't get what you want? What if whatever your first choice is, say that's not possible, would you be willing to accept something else, or would you rather the research not be done? Now, I realize you can't see what's on the left, but those were the series of ways we asked the questions. But what you can see on the right side is that if they initially preferred verbal or written permission, But that could not happen. It was not feasible. It was too difficult to do. Would they prefer that the research not be conducted? And what you can see here is that the majority still thought the research should be done if that was not possible to get what they wanted. But there was a minority, anywhere between 25 and 37%, who would prefer that the research not be done. So that was one of the findings of our study. We also, if I mentioned, we also had done a survey of IRB chairs, of IRB members rather, and we asked them similar questions. And what I want to point out here in this thing is if you look over on the left, Perimeter stands for people who belong to this IRB organization, that they made a very big distinction. And on the bottom, it talks about discussion and written permission. They made a very big distinction between randomization and medical record review, 82 to 38%, in terms of how they'd approach those studies. So very similar to OHRP. If you're randomizing, you get written consent. If you're doing medical record review, not as important. We asked patients that question. As you notice, they were kind of in the middle. And in fact, and they were not, they did not have that same sort of extreme view that, and distinction between those two. So one of the things we learned is that, again, patients really didn't distinguish between randomization and medical record review. And in fact, they were less concerned than IRB members were about these approaches. We also asked them who should get permission for being in a randomized study. And we asked patients this question, 85% prefer that their doctor do this. Whereas we asked the IRB members, 52% thought that clinicians were the least preferred person to do this compared to study coordinators or researchers. So another difference between the two. When our paper was published, there was an editorial that came with it that was written by John Lantos, who some of you may know, who's over here at Mercy Children's. And the final sentence of his editorial was, it's time to ask whether a system in which the fundamental principle is respect for persons can continue to ignore the preferences of many of the persons it claims to respect. Now, I was certainly obviously sympathetic with that view. I think it's a bit more complicated than that because the question is, how do we actually do this? What should we actually do? And how should we engage informed consent for these types of studies? So that was one of my lingering questions, which is two. How do we approach informed consent for rampant medical practice? I'll make a few comments about that. But the other question that was lingering for me was, well, I showed you that one video. Well, what impact did those videos themselves have? How effective were they? Because we made those videos. We did some focus groups, but we didn't really know what role the videos played. So I just want to mention very quickly that we've subsequently done a follow-up survey. We talked to some of the folks in Spokane, and we learned more about why they gave the answers they gave, what some of the issues they were facing were, and we revised the survey. We actually shortened it. We kind of focused on randomization, but we also randomized people in our own study to the videos that we made, and we took the same content and we converted them into comics. We converted them into text. We converted them into a text video with PowerPoint, and we also had a control in which it just had the definition of ROMP that I showed you in the very first slide. And what's interesting is that the one that did the best was actually the PowerPoint video with the voiceover, not even the one that I showed you. But these certainly did better than the control and better than the text. And what's important to remember is that when you think about it, for typical informed consent, what do we typically rely on? It's usually text. Text did not do as well as these other approaches. So I want to end with a couple slides, because I want to leave us some time for questions, about some thoughts about how do we improve informed consent. So I think the challenge here is that lengthy informed consent documents can actually undermine comprehension and decision-making and make research harder to do. If any of you who've bought a house and have signed a mortgage, you know what it's like to read these long forms, and often the decision is made not based upon reading that form, but actually on things that happened beforehand. But clearly we want to educate people better, and the challenge is that a lot of information is harder to understand. And you actually know this from your classes. The more you read, the less you understand. And if you can have a more condensed version, it's often easier to follow and track. At least for me it was. So ideally, modifying informed consent is a good thing to do. The challenge is that the regulations require that the only time you can modify consent is if you believe the study is minimal risk. So the OHRP draft guidance, which said these were substantially risky studies, would preclude any possibility of waiving or altering informed consent. There would be no opportunity to prioritize what's really important because the expectation would be you have to give everything. Now, the question is, well, what would I like to do if I could? So this is, to a large extent, what I'd like to do is really very much motivated by an article that was published this past summer in JAMA Pediatrics by Elliot Weiss and Steve Jaffe. And they made a proposal for how they think informed decision-making for comparative effectiveness research trials should be done. And they really kind of turned around the way we typically think of informed consent, which is to sort of say, here's the clinical stuff, here's the research stuff. Actually, I should take it back. They usually, the normal informed consent forms focus on the research only. What they suggest is we focus on the clinical problem you're facing. There's two good treatments, but we don't know which is better. You can either get treatment A, you can get treatment B. Here's what we believe are the risks and benefits of treatment A. Here's what we believe are the risks of treatment B. We like to do a study. You can either pick treatment A or B, or you can be in the study in which we have this through the randomization process. The only discomforts of being in the study, if you don't have a preference for which drug you're on, we have to fill out some additional questionnaires. This was what they suggested. The one that I would add to this, and this is something that I myself use a lot in projects I do, is I often say, let's think about what are 3 reasons why some people may join and some people may not join. The reason why I like this one is because I think it's a way of, number 1, sending a message. This is still your choice. 2 is giving people reasons that they can look and say, gee, I identify with that reason, I identify with this reason. Either I want people to benefit from my experience, that's why I may choose to be in the study, or I really like treatment A. So for example, I know I would not want propranolol for my high blood pressure because I like to bicycle ride, and I would not want to have to be on propranolol and trying to go up a big hill. So to me, there's no way I would ever be in a randomized trial where I could get propranolol. I just wouldn't go there. But other people may not care about that and actually like propranolol because it makes them a lot more calm when they're giving talks and things like that. So with this, I'm going to end. And we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, discussion. So questions, thoughts?